So did AMD's work on their AI upscaler overlap with PSSR's development? Did Sony know about this? Or were they forced to push ahead with their own tech because AMD's solution simply wasn't ready when they needed it? Is Sony's PSSR actually the key to PlayStation's future, or will AMD's new FSR 4 tech make it obsolete? Why is Xbox relying so much on AMD's tech while Sony is pushing their own solution? And most importantly, will PSSR on the PS6 give PlayStation a massive edge over Xbox? The answers to these questions are a lot more complicated than you might think. So Sony built PSSR because, at the time, AMD didn't believe machine learning was necessary for high-quality upscaling. Sony, on the other hand, thought ML-based upscaling was the way forward. So they went ahead and developed their own upscaler, along with a dedicated hardware block to support it. But here's where things get really interesting. Fast forward a bit, and AMD does a complete 180. Suddenly, they're all in on ML upscaling, working on their own AI-powered tech. And not only that, Sony and AMD have now formed a partnership specifically for AI development. Now, this raises a huge question. If AMD is already putting resources into FSR4, why would Sony keep investing in PSSR? Doesn't that just seem like a waste of time, money, and effort? Originally, the logic behind PSSR made a lot of sense. Sony needed an ML-based upscaler, and AMD wasn't offering one. So Sony had no choice but to make their own. But then, CES 2025 happened. Out of nowhere, AMD drops an AI-powered upscaler that looks really good. And here's the thing, upscaling tech isn't something you build overnight. This had to have been in development for a while. The timing issue. Did Sony jump too early? The key problem here seems to be timing. Sony started working on PSSR years ago because there was no viable alternative. Then, at some point in the middle of all this, AMD changed its stance and decided that ML upscaling was the future. By that time, though, Sony was already too far along in their own development cycle to pivot away from PSSR. If we go back to an interview with an AMD spokesperson, they mentioned that about 10 to 12 months ago, they told their team, hey, machine learning is the future. We need to make FSR with ML. But by that point, Sony had already spent years working on PSSR. They were already past the point where they could just scrap everything and wait for AMD's solution. PSSR can deliver results that rival native 4K rendering. Games like The Last of Us, Part 1, and Spider-Man 2 are excellent examples. In The Last of Us, PSSR delivers crisp visuals with high-res rendering and smooth frame rates. Honestly, it's almost indistinguishable from native 4K in some scenarios. Similarly, Spider-Man 2 and Ratchet & Clank showcase beautiful ray-traced reflections that demonstrate what PSSR can do when paired with high-quality rendering pipelines. It's clear that with the right setup, this tech can elevate gaming visuals to a whole new level. But here's where things get messy. Games like Silent Hill 2, Jedi Survivor, and even Dragon's Dogma 2 show PSSR at its worst. The ray-traced lighting in these games often appears noisy, and in some cases, the upscaling is so poorly implemented that it actually looks worse than older techniques like TAA or even FSR. Take Silent Hill 2, for example. The reflections are muddy, and the overall image quality is a significant downgrade compared to other titles using similar tech. And Jedi Survivor? Let's just say the issues with foliage flickering and noisy reflections make it clear that PSSR isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So, why do some games excel while others flop? It boils down to implementation. Digital Foundry points out that PSSR performs best with less demanding scenarios, games targeting higher internal resolutions with fewer ray-traced effects. However, when you throw complex lighting, reflections, and low-res input into the mix, PSSR struggles to keep up. Another issue is developer resources. Not every studio has the time or budget to optimize PSSR for their game. In fact, some titles, like Alan Wake 2, shipped with glaring visual issues that make you wonder how they passed QA at all. Here's the big question. Can PSSR improve over time? Sony has been tight-lipped about future updates, but there's hope. Similar to how NVIDIA's DLSS evolved dramatically from its early versions, PSSR could benefit from continued training and refinement. One interesting suggestion from Digital Foundry is adding a system-level toggle for users to update PSSR independently, allowing improvements to roll out across all games. That would be a game changer for titles stuck with older implementations, like Jedi Survivor. However, it remains to be seen if Sony will go this route. At the end of the day, PSSR is a promising technology, but it's clearly still a work in progress. When done right, it can rival native rendering and deliver incredible visuals. But for now, it's a bit of a gamble. Some games shine, while others make you question whether the PS5 Pro's potential is being fully realized. Is Sony's PSSR actually the the key to PlayStation's future, or will AMD's new FSR 4 tech make it obsolete? Sony doesn't want to be at the mercy of AMD's FSR tech. And honestly, that makes perfect sense. Think about it. FSR 2 runs on both PlayStation and Xbox right now, but let's be real, it's not great on consoles. On PC, you can tweak settings, optimize based on your hardware, and get different results depending on your rig. But on consoles, you don't get that luxury. The implementation is locked down, meaning the results are entirely dependent on how well AMD's tech plays with the console hardware. And that's a problem, especially for Sony. Now look at Xbox. They're completely dependent on AMD's upscaling tech. They're relying heavily on FSR 3, and let's be honest, the results aren't exactly blowing anyone away. Sony doesn't want to be in that position. That's why PSSR exists. Because Sony needs their own upscaling tech that they can control, improve, and make exclusive to PlayStation. Some people are saying, well, FSR 4 and DLSS 4 are way better than PSSR. And yeah, you're not wrong. No argument there. I've seen what a 4090 can do, and it's incredible. But here's the thing. How many people actually own a 4090? Most PC gamers are not running a 3.5K to 4K rig. In fact, a huge chunk of them are struggling to run modern games at even a base PlayStation 5 level. So next time you see someone say, PSSR sucks, DLSS is way better, ask yourself, are they running a mid-range or low-end PC and cherry-picking examples? Or do they have a top-tier GPU and are completely ignoring the fact that most people don't? Because in the console space, Sony can't just rely on AMD to solve their problems. They need to build their own tech, not just so they can keep up, but so they can own and refine their upscaling for the long term. PSSR is a long-term investment. It might not be the best right now, but Sony will keep improving it, adding features, optimizing it for their own hardware, and making sure it works better than anything AMD can offer on PlayStation. And when we get to the PS6, guess what? Sony won't be stuck with whatever AMD decides to do with FSR. They'll already have their own battle-tested PlayStation-exclusive upscaling tech. That's the real game changer. Alright, here's something exciting that could make 8K gaming on the PlayStation 6 not just a marketing buzzword, but an actual realistic feature. At CES 2025, the HDMI forum announced the next-gen HDMI 2.2 standard, which cranks bandwidth all the way up to 96 gigabits per second. Let's break down what that means for the PS6 and gaming in general. The new HDMI 2.2 spec is a massive leap over HDMI 2.1. With this update, you're looking at support for 4K up to 480 Hz, insane refresh rates that might make sense for competitive gamers, 8K up to 240 Hz, yes, native 8K gaming at refresh rates that are ridiculous for any console so far, and that with advanced ray tracing and HDR, and we're talking about visuals that could rival reality. This also addresses one of the main criticisms of 8K gaming. It's been mostly theoretical because of bandwidth limitations. HDMI 2.2 removes that bottleneck, so the hardware won't hold back what developers can create. And with 8K TVs slowly becoming more common, Sony could market the PS6 as the perfect console for high-end home theaters. Here's another benefit. HDMI 2.2 also promises to fix a problem that's plagued home theaters forever: audio sync issues. You know how sometimes the dialogue doesn't quite match up with the lips on screen? Gone. 7. Alright, so the main stuff here comes from this leaker, Kepler L2. You might have heard of him. He's the guy who nailed the specs for the PS5 Pro before anyone else. Like, he even talked about how the PS5 Pro would include RDNA 4 features for ray tracing, and that was basically confirmed later. So yeah, he's pretty legit. Now he's saying the PS6 design is done. It's in this stage called pre-silicon validation. Don't worry, I'll explain what that means. Pre-silicon validation is basically when they test the chip design super hard before they actually manufacture it. Kepler also mentioned something called AO tapeout, which is when they physically make the first chip. That's apparently happening late this year. If that timeline holds, we're looking at a release window for the PS6 around 2027. Sony usually takes about 2 years from AO tapeout to console launch. So yeah, 2027 checks out. Now, someone online, probably one of those tech nerds, was worried that Sony might use older tech like N3, which wouldn't be a huge jump from what we have now. But Kepler chimed in and said, nope, some of it could be on N2 tech, which is better. He even dropped Zen 6 into the mix. If you're not familiar, Zen 6 is AMD's upcoming CPU tech, and it's miles ahead of what we've got now. The PS5 and PS5 Pro are running Zen Gen 2 CPUs, which came out back in 2019. If Zen 6 lands in 2026, like the rumors say, the PS6 could launch with that. It would be a massive jump in CPU performance. As for the GPU, Kepler said it's an early fork of AMD's new unified structure, which people online are calling RDNA 5. This is the same tech AMD announced last year, and it's rumored to launch in 2026. And there's this other feature called 3DV cache, which is basically a fancy way of saying the CPU can access info way faster. It stacks more memory on the chip without making it bigger. What does that mean for you? Faster performance and smoother gameplay. If you want to be ahead of all the gaming leaks and news, specifically PlayStation news, time for you to subscribe. And as always, a like on the video is very much appreciated.